Okay, so this video is going to be about the birth narratives that are found in Matthew and Luke, but we'll take a look at the first chapters of John and Mark as well, just to give a little bit of an explanation for that. Okay, so in terms of the historical setting, this is once again still at the chapter 12 PowerPoint, and you should read chapter 12, obviously. In terms of Mark, the author's name is potentially John Mark, like I had mentioned in the last video. Probably a date of, just before or after 70, was probably written in Greek, and the audience is more likely to be Gentiles or non-Jews. Okay? I actually wanted to point out that this is where I inserted some information about what did Jesus do, okay? And also a description about that last week of his life, his Passion Week of trial, crucifixion, and resurrection. So I'll come back to this when we start going over the life of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, okay? All right, so there are two birth narratives in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, and these are in the part of the Bible called the New Testament, as you already know. There are four Gospels there, which are parallel stories describing the story of Jesus. There's also a book called The Acts of the Apostles, which Luke is the author of, which describes what happened with Jesus' disciples after he died in Jerusalem and Judea. There are also in the New Testament various letters from Paul to different Christian communities that he started in places like Corinth and Philippi and Galatia in Greece, and then Turkey, Ephesus in Turkey, and then of course Rome in Italy. And you will be looking at several selections from the letter to the Romans and the letter to the Galatians. Okay? All right. So the main doctrine is the incarnation, which is the belief that Jesus was fully God and fully human. And then we don't really know a lot about Jesus's childhood. So that notion of the incarnation is actually talked about in the birth narratives. Okay? Let's see. Okay, so in terms of the Gospel of Matthew, actually, let me just reduce that and look at. I just wanted to point out. Let's go over Mark's first, and then I'll show John's, and then I'll go into Matthew and Luke's more detailed passages. So with the Gospel of Mark, you will notice that in chapter 1, Jesus is already a grown-up. Okay, there is no birth narrative in the Gospel of Mark. And it actually starts with John the Baptist preaching in the wilderness, at which point Jesus comes as a grown-up from Nazareth and is baptized by John in the Jordan. Now, how does that tie in with the themes of Mark? Well, as I mentioned in the earlier video, one of the themes of Mark is that he moves very quickly through the life of Jesus, and in fact, starts off when he's the age of 30 and kind of rapidly goes into his mission and the work that he does. The book is only 16 chapters long, but the last, I believe, 7 chapters has to do with when he goes into Jerusalem and that last week of his life. So the theme of having no birth narrative in Mark ties into the idea that Mark is more interested in the death of Christ and what that represents rather than the birth of Christ and what that might represent. So the lack of a birth narrative indicates Mark likes to move quickly towards the end, at which point he slows down when it's the last week of Jesus's life. Okay? Let me show you John. Now, if you look at the Gospel of John, chapter 1, there also is no birth narrative. Okay, it's you notice the style of John is very oblique and very kind of not cosmic, but centered on the figure of Christ as the Son of God and the Son of Man. So in terms of a historical narrative or a biographical narrative, you really don't have that. So the entire Gospel, if you looked at the PowerPoint describing the themes of the Gospels, is really centered on Jesus the person. So what he says and who he interacts with, and less on where did he go, what time of year was it, things like that is less important. So the biographical parts are kind of pushed to the side, and the things focused on what he did and what he said is much more central. So if you notice in the beginning of John, it just says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. Okay, no mention of Mary, no mention of Nazareth, no mention of Bethlehem. It's just kind of setting into order, into place, the fact that he became in existence. That's it. Okay? So, when you have, and the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of his Father's only Son, full of grace and truth, that is kind of John's way of saying he became incarnated and appeared on this earth. But there's no kind of secondary details like there are in the birth narratives. So let's take a look at those. And let me take a look at the PowerPoint too really quick. So in terms of Matthew, there once again we're not sure who the author is. He seems familiar with Jewish laws and customs, meaning he's got a great interest in tying in the life of Jesus as a continuation of the Jewish traditions or the Jewish texts. So Matthew is the one that will frequently say, as it said in the prophet Jeremiah, or as it said in the prophet Isaiah, to try to kind of form a bridge between the Old Testament and the New. Matthew definitely used Mark as a source, probably dated to about 75 to 85 CE. And his intended audience, because he seems really familiar with Jewish laws and customs, seem to be Jewish Christians. Okay? Now, in Matthew chapters 1 through 3, Jesus was born in 4 BCE because he actually was born 4 years before we thought he was born. His father was Joseph from the tribe of Judah, and his mother was Mary. Both of them were living in Bethlehem in Judea at the time. This is different from Luke. One day Mary is visited by an angel named Gabriel, and at this point the Holy Spirit impregnates her. So Joseph is not the father of this baby. The Holy Spirit or God is. Okay? At this time, King Herod, who really legitimately was the governor at the time, heard of the special child, so he hires 3 magi or magicians or wise men who were kind of like fortune tellers to find the child so that he could quote unquote worship him as well, which really meant he needs to find the baby and kill it. The Magi know that. They find the baby. They give him gold, frankincense, and myrrh, which actually are gifts. When you say gifts fit for a king, they're actually gifts that you would bring to a coronation ceremony for a king. Gold, because it's valuable. You would burn frankincense. It's an incense. And then myrrh is actually kind of a dusty oil that you would anoint someone with. So these are things that you would bring to when you would anoint a king. They go home another way. The angel Gabriel warns Joseph and Mary that Herod is still after them, so they run away to Egypt to hide until Herod dies. But because Herod's son was king at this point, Joseph and Mary ran away to the north of Galilee, where they settle in Nazareth, away from Herod's influence or his son's influence. And at this point, of course, like I said before, Judea and Galilee were separate regions. So let's take a look at that. One of the themes of Matthew is that he likes to, connect the Old Testament with the New. So one thing that demonstrates that is literally through the genealogy of Jesus. So you'll notice that he begins with Abraham, and 7 generations later is David, and then 7 generations later is the exile, and then 14, and then 14 generations later is Jesus. So he kind of ties in Jesus all the way back to Abraham, making it seem like Jesus is just a continuation of that historical genealogy. Genealogies also are featured in the Old Testament, so that's another kind of tie-in to the Old Testament. So her husband Joseph, being a righteous man, wanted to dismiss her, divorce her, because she was found with child, but in This story, the angel appears to Joseph and tells him that he will bear a son and he'll be named Jesus. So the messaging actually comes to Joseph, not Mary. Why? Because Matthew is much more traditional to Jewish laws and customs, and the spokesperson and the person who speaks for the family is usually the father or the husband. It's patriarchal. So in this case, Mary is not the one that the angel comes to, but Joseph is, because it's much more traditional. Okay? And then this is when King Herod says, I need to find this baby. He calls the Magi. The Magi found the baby and were overwhelmed with joy, and they gave him gifts. After they left, the angel said, go to hide in Egypt until Herod dies, which they do. And then when they come back, they end up going up to Nazareth. Now, one of the themes, like I said, for Matthew is tying it into making that it's a smooth transition from the old and the new. And what better way of doing that than by making Jesus kind of like the new Moses? The greatest figure of the Old Testament is Moses. And remember in Exodus 1-3 when the Pharaoh wanted to kill all the firstborn of Egypt, so Moses had to be hidden, and then he actually escapes away from Egypt eventually to go to the promised land, Canaan, which would include, of course, Judea. So there's clearly a parallel being drawn here between Jesus and Moses, where Jesus has to escape out of Judea as a little baby because the king wants to kill him, and has to go to Egypt and hide for safety, right? While Moses, as a baby, has to go, not as a baby because later he's a grown-up, but he is endangered as a baby too because the king wants to kill him, and eventually will have to escape out of Egypt towards Canaan, which would include Judea and Jerusalem, towards there for safety. So it's clearly a parallel between Jesus and Moses, where in both cases they are being threatened by the king when they're a baby, and then have to be hidden and escape. So that's kind of ties in with the theme of continuing, the Old Testament. Okay, and then then it's John the Baptist again. All right, so let's take a look at Luke. One thing that's the theme of Luke, by the way, is that he has a lot of information. He likes to include everything that he's kind of researched. So he will always name places. Whenever Jesus goes from one spot to the other, he'll make sure that he names the cities and the people that were with him, etc. So in the Gospel of Luke, who's also the Gospel writer of Acts, this birth narrative talks about John the Baptist first, and sort of parallels the birth narrative of John the Baptist with the birth of Jesus. In this case, Mary is visited by Gabriel, not Joseph, who tells her she's highly favored. The Holy Spirit impregnates again. Mary and Joseph had been living in Nazareth, but they had to go to Bethlehem in Judea for a census. So Joseph was originally from Judea and has to go down there. So in both stories, Jesus is born in Bethlehem, but the reasons behind it are different. There was no room at the inn because everyone was coming back to Judea, so she had to give birth in a barn. The shepherds saw the star in the field, and they came and kind of gave presents. So in this case, there are no magi. There's no magician. There's no King Herod. There's no danger to the baby. It's just the shepherds and a census, and then they kind of went back to Nazareth. So relatively, uneventful. So if we take a look at it, it begins once again with the story of John the Baptist with Zechariah and Elizabeth, and they are also told that their son is going to be special, at which point chapter 2 says, Mary is visited by Gabriel, and this son is going to be special. And this is the description of them having to go for the census. Then the shepherds and the angels saw the baby. There's one unusual story here where Jesus was a teenager. Once again, Luke has a lot of extra material, so he's the only one that actually has a story of Jesus as a young man, and a lot of extra characters. And then, of course, you have chapter 3, which is John the Baptist baptizing Jesus. So very different birth narratives. The Magi, a good way of remembering it is Matthew, Magi, and then you could say Luke, shepherds, right? And the Magi and the shepherds were never in the same place. He was only in danger in Matthew. It was just a census in Luke. So next time we will start going over the Gospel of Mark, and I will go over those themes.